Okay, so we're going very high with that. And that's right channel? Okay, testing 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
"45 minutes. Yeah, and then questions. Hello. Hello. Good. Thank you all for coming. Merci à tous d'être venus en si grand nombre. Il y a une couple d'autres personnes qui s'installent. I am Josée Drouin-Brisebois, the Senior Curator of Contemporary Art at the National Gallery of Canada. Before we begin the introductions, I would like to acknowledge that the land we are on today has, for thousands of years, been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The land continues to be home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We're grateful to be able to live and work here. I'd like to thank the Art Museum for hosting the exhibition and this talk, and of course to the Sobey Art Foundation. The panel talk will last about 45 minutes, and there will be a question period at the end. Before I give over the floor to our distinguished guests, I would like to give a very brief introduction of each of the artists who have been shortlisted for the Sobey Art Award and our moderator. Starting from the Atlantic provinces and moving west, this year's finalists are Lucilla Johnson. Lucilla is a performance and installation artist of Mi'kmaq First Nation ancestry. Johnson often uses Mi'kmaq basket weaving and social relations as material for her work. She explores various mediums, including performance art, sculpture, music, and printmaking, while utilizing delegated performers as well as collaborative processes. In her work, Ursula draws attention to the valence of place, particularly as it has been transformed by human intervention and colonization. Since graduating from NASCAD in 2006, she has participated in over 30 group shows and 5 solo exhibitions, some of which have traveled. So Ursula. Jacinthe Carrier. Through photography and video, Jacinthe Carrier explores relationships between bodies and the environment and different ways of conceptualizing and appropriating the land. Gravitating toward natural locations that bear traces of human presence, she directs a cast of figures whose collective gestures, often repetitive in nature, invoke rite and ritual. Orchestrating mysterious occasions and hermetic atmospheres, her scenarios involve fragile kinships organized around a shared landscape. Jacinthe holds an MA in Visual Arts from Concordia University and has taken part in several solo and group exhibitions, notably in Canada, France, Mexico, and the United States. She was recipient of the Prix Pierre Ayot in 2012 and Prix Vider Création in 2015. Jacinthe. Brigitte Moser. Brigitte Moser's performances and videos exist at the intersection of prop comedy, theater of the absurd, and intuitive dance. Through precisely scripted monologues, she offers personalized eyewitness accounts of media landscapes, scenarios, and emotional terrains triggered by the direct and continuous feed of screen time, into the human nervous system. Selected for the William and Meredith Soderson Prize for Emerging Artists, Brigitte has presented projects throughout the US and Europe. She's also been a resident artist at the Banff Center and the Fondazione Antonio Ratti in Como, Italy, and is a 2016 Toronto Friends of the Visual Arts Finalist Prize recipient. Brigitte. Divya Mehra. Working in a variety of mediums, Divya Mehra addresses the effects of colonization and institutional racism, recontextualizing references found in hip-hop, literature, and current affairs. Mehra's practice explores diasporic identities, racializations, otherness, and the construct of diversity. Some of her works, especially those in the current exhibition, are underwritten by poignant personal and historical narratives related to assimilation, loss, theft, displacement, and transmutation, all invoked materially. Divya. I'll just add, she also has exhibitions at PS1 MoMA. Her work has been shown on MTV, Mass MoCA, and the Beijing Biennial. She holds an MFA from Columbia University. Sorry, different page. Raymond Boisjoli is an indigenous artist of Haida descent. His practice concerns the deployment of images, objects, and materials in and as indigenous art, using a reflexive approach to foreground the discourses that frame and delimit the work produced by indigenous artists. He uses language as both text and graphic sign in order to press the tension between polemics and aesthetics. Boisjoli has been included in exhibitions and projects in France, in Canada, and at Site Santa Fe. He's an assistant professor of interdisciplinary studio in the Department of Visual Art and Material Practice at Emily Carr University of Art and Design. Raymond Boisjoli. Last but not least, our wonderful moderator and facilitator, Robert Enright. Robert is the senior contributing editor for Border Crossings magazine and teaches art theory and criticism in the graduate program of the School of Fine Art and Music at the University of Guelph. He has written extensively about contemporary art and has conducted hundreds of interviews with artists in Border Crossings and in books and exhibition catalogs. In 2005, he was made a member of the Order of Canada, and in 2016 was awarded an honorary Doctor of Letters by the University of Winnipeg. Robert Enright. And one last thing, I just want to say that after the discussion, we invite you all to come to the public opening of the exhibition at the Art Museum. Thank you.
Thank you, Josie. Is the mic on? It doesn't sound like it is, so that's probably a good sign. I have a bit of a cold, so I apologize for the nasal voice. It usually sounds a little bit less nose, but it's a good sized nose anyway, doesn't it? What I want to do first of all is to get you, and I'll start at your end, Ramon, is to just, because some people here may not have seen the show yet, the work that's in the show, just to get you to describe what it is people will see so that we get a kind of verbal equivalent of what is existing in real space.
So the work that is at the Art Museum currently is a text-based work that stresses the complicated relationship between a text and its physical carrier. It's like words on a page, like trying to rethink that relationship. So I've created a tiled work that, in a fragmentary manner, articulates the word discordancy, word meaning the character of being constituted by diverse parts in tension with one another. So it's not a harmonious thing, but it's like a conflict of sorts.
Is discordancy a word?
Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, I didn't know it was.
Love to make up a word like that.
No, you didn't invent the word. You just
forget what I said.
I like the idea you invented it. Divya, do you want to say what it is you've got in the back room of the gallery?
Sure, yeah. Oh, yeah, this mic is so crazy.
It's weird. You want to be disembodied from it.
Yeah,
somehow.
that's so weird. I have a few objects. I have like a gold jaguar, and that has just been sort of like turned into a really nice shape, and a few bricks, and I have, like, I'm just going to physically describe these things, and then like a base to a statue that was once a statue for Lord Ganesh, who's a Hindu deity. And then on the ground, there's this very precious, beautiful vinyl rug that's been photoshopped. And then, yeah.
Is the rug in your possession, or the original rug that's been photoshopped?
I mean, the internet possesses.
Yes.
Yeah, the internet possesses, like all the rugs are like sourced from, there's like 9 rugs that have been sourced from the internet, so that make up the one rug in the space.
One practical question. Lots of people, including Winnipeg, saw the Jaguar before you turned it into a different kind of object.
Yeah.
It looks twice as long as it was. Now, is it attenuated somehow?
Yeah, like I added this like sort of like slimy, like elastis, like no, it's just, it's what sort of happened during the process. Like we just were able to like stretch it out when we were squishing it.
Okay.
It's really cool. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
good.
it's a thing that happens.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beauty of physics.
Yeah.
Well, it does look so much longer. It
Yeah,
looked like something
yeah.
happened to it other than what happened to it.
Yeah, yeah.
Ursula, what have you got?
Well, I have this giant moose fence, and then there's the type of fence that you would see if you're driving along Trans-Canada Highway, and then there's a wire fence all around the perimeter with 2 doors that open, kind of swing out, I guess, like this way. And then there's programmed LED lighting in the space, and then there's also a vinyl floor-to-ceiling wallpaper with a repeat design.
And the design is one that we've seen before in your work, I guess, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. And you built it here.
Yes, we built it in the space. This piece was specifically designed for the gallery in the art museum, that center gallery.
Did you have to bring the way to get into it? Was that brought from the Maritimes with you?
Everything was shipped. So
The wood
the
too?
original, the wood. Well, the wood wasn't shipped. Everything was bought here, and then it was all shipped to the gallery. So the gate, what's referred to as an undulate gate, so that's animals with hooved feet. It was engineered and designed by M&G Fencing, which is based out of Sudbury, Ontario, and that's where we were able to source that. So they were the original kind of engineers of this design for these gates all along the Trans-Canada Highway from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Ontario.
Would a non-ungulate animal not be welcome or be electrocuted or something if it tried to get in there? There's no.
We can go in
You
there.
could-
Yeah.
we can too.
We don't need
I
hooved feet
did,
to go
yeah,
in.
yeah.
And it's been modified for, kind of to encourage, almost like a draw for humans to want to try to interact or maybe feel like they could, but maybe not be able to, for whatever reason, maybe fear.
Yeah, we'll get to that notion of how approachable, how you feel you want to enter it, and what happens when you do. It's an interesting experience for the human body. I don't know what it's like for a moose body, but you can let us know about that too.
Oh, I don't know either.
I
I haven't interviewed any moose yet about it.
We're working on that.
Yeah.
It's being border crossings, the interview with a moose.
Oh, good.
Bridget?
Yes.
By the way, what is the name of the piece that you performed here?
That is Every Room is a Waiting Room, Part 3.
Part 3, okay.
So to get into the space where my work is, you have to kind of push your body through these plastic slats that you might find in, for example, like a meat locker or something like this. And then when you get into the room, there's this sort of wall structure that has a video that's being projected onto it. And I am in the video manipulating various objects, and the kind of dominant color scheme that these objects come from is the Pantone 2016 Color of the Year, which is in fact 2 colors. And then there's a small monitor on the other side of the room with headphones. That's kind of a companion piece to that has no objects in it. And then during performances, which will happen from time to time, the screen for the video becomes a performance backdrop.
those are the colors of the year, that pink and blue?
Those are the color of the year
Really?
of last year. Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, you know, it's interesting. The colors in my design are the colors of this year from the Pantone palette for spring and summer fashion.
It's perfect. Yeah. We're on trend.
You may have to pay royalties if they find out about that, but so let's keep it quiet. And what have you done?
So I have like 3 pieces from 3 different body of work. And when you enter the room, you have this series of photography from 2016 called La Lignée, which is an overview of my 8 years of many projects that I tried to kind of put together and see the filiation or the connection between all of these projects. And this line of photography kind of opened up to 2 video rooms on each side. So you have the piece Cycle from 2015 and the piece Crypt from 2014. And these 2 videos and installation are in a way going into an image or going into a performance that I kind of created.
Mm-hmm. So none of the photographs between the 2 videos, are any of the images from either of the 2 videos we're seeing?
Yes.
There are some. I didn't know that I recognized any, actually. They look like they're all from different works.
No, I mean, there are some video stills and from
Right.
stills photography, from like film photography. And some of the images on the series are from the video as well, because my work is always kind of this dialogue between photography and video. But most of these images are images that were not picked for these actual projects. So it's like these images that you have that you really like, but for somehow doesn't fit in the project, and you wonder what you're going to do with it. And then I kind of revisit these projects and try to make a together of all these images.
Mm-hmm.
So
And when you install shows, the way that you install photographs is they become almost not a grid, but there are a number of photographs all the time, aren't there? When you have a video piece as well as there are photographs with them?
yeah, but it's not always like a systemic amount. Like
Yeah,
it depends.
right.
So sometimes it can be just one. But
Okay.
sometimes it can be a series. It
Okay.
depends.
I wanted to, many years ago, Northrop Frye, the Canadian theorist and literary critic, it was a time in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, when the notion of Canadian identity was a big deal. And Frye, in a famous essay in a book of essays on the Canadian imagination, said that if you ask, who am I, you're asking the wrong question of a Canadian. What you ask a Canadian is, where is here? And if you answer where is here, then the answer about who am I follows from that. And since the Sobey Award is an award that's been set up in a way regionally through place, I want to get a sense of, from each of you, whether or not place of one kind or another is determining in what you do. And that place could be everything from culture to the specifics of geography or landscape or anything else. But is that a legitimate way of framing your work in any way through the notion of place? Where is here?
I think about the geopolitical circumstances of art, where art was something that issued from a particular place, like from Europe to the rest of the world, and to think of like what that is, being an Indigenous person in British Columbia, in terms of what it means to work as an artist. So I think, like a lot of those things, participating in this specific opportunity in relation to those things, there is like a tension there. So I think in terms of that, thinking about that, that relationship, it's not necessarily an easy one for me, being somebody that doesn't necessarily identify as a Canadian, but being sort of incidentally Canadian. It's just a matter of biography. It's my passport. It's like the means through which I can travel internationally. So there's a contingent character to it. I wouldn't necessarily take that as being sort of determining in a way of like who I am really. Like there are other, I guess, things I would privilege over and above that.
David, do you have a sense that the where is here question is a useful one to ask of you? Your here is sort of Winnipeg, but your here is also a cultural here, which is pretty rich.
Yeah, I mean, like my here is Winnipeg, but it's been, I mean, it's been such difficult, both like difficult and inspiring place to call here. Growing up and then going to study art at the University of Manitoba was like a really difficult and challenging experience. Is that hard to believe?
No, I don't know. You know.
It is. I like that laugh. You're like, are you sure? Yeah, I mean, I think that like Winnipeg has like, the work that I make is like in direct response to that space. Yeah. And almost like a refusal to be a part of that space and how that space sort of has defined itself in terms of the work that's coming out of there.
Mm-hmm. So your work is resistant to the kind of aesthetic ideology that seems to have emerged, the DIY kind of thing out of Winnipeg, that part of that?
Yeah, like I'm not making painting. I mean, I don't think that's a surprise. Like I'm not making painting or drawing, and I'm not saying that there's like any specific problem with that, but I mean, in terms of the landscape that, you know, is Winnipeg is known for and Winnipeg is celebrated for, I think it's not like crushing jaguars and putting like textworks on the wall that say I'm Indian, so I'm in this show. Like, there's not that dialogue is not very present. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
So the place plays into your work clearly.
Yeah, quite often. I think if, like, where is here, if I was thinking about, like, locally with regards to myself, I would definitely, I'm a very proud Cape Brettoner and proud Maritimer, and Eskasoni First Nation on the Bredor Lakes and in between the mountains is, like, home, and that's where, you know, kind of that's where my roots are. But also because I've traveled quite often and worked in a variety of disciplines, I've been exploring more this notion of kind of memory or the nostalgia of the history of the peoples, you know, the different events, the languages, the sounds, all of these different things that you know, kind of that remains in a static but non-static way. I don't know, sometimes maybe that seems a little bit far-stretched when I say something like that. But all of this information that I feel like is kind of left in these places that we move through and move about and go back to, I feel like there's a really interesting memory that's there, and that's something that I often try to find when I'm creating new works by, you know, engaging with communities or different cultural educational institutions and kind of finding those stories and gathering them. And then from that point, then I really respond to things like maybe the environmental or geologic kind of impact of the area and architecture, and that's definitely something that I've been really kind of really drawn and attracted to the past couple of years, and it's definitely informed. Like coming with this piece, for instance, you know, when I saw the floor plans and I saw an intersecting gallery, I was like, I know exactly what I need to build there, because I've had this idea that I needed to make, but I needed the intersecting gallery in order for it to exist. So it's definitely, you know, when I have the privilege to go to a place before creating it, then that visit and the interaction with that place definitely informs the work. So I would say it's a pretty big process for myself.
Yeah. So you're hearing this is actually even a practical one of the space that the thing you make goes into.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And that's a perfect. I mean, I guess you made the perfect piece for that room, is what I'm saying, rather than the room was right. I mean, you made the piece fitted. It could have been a different. Or the room was
perfect for the piece.
Yeah, Brigitte, I don't know if the where is here questions is sort of a fairer one for you, because your here seems to be
here.
Right now, and the internet, the rest of everything else in the world. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe it's less relevant in terms of content, but is fairly relevant in terms of like process in some ways. I mean, yeah, I also have spent greater portions of my life living in Vancouver and Montreal. I've been in Toronto the shortest period of my life, but also kind of at a really integral moment for the work that I've been making. And when I first started making these sorts of performances that are now what I do, I remember sort of feeling like, oh, I don't know where this belongs at all. And then luckily I had been at a residency at the Banff Center with many other artists kind of working in a similar way. And John McCurley and Amy Lamb, who make up the artistic duo Life of a Craphead, were also there and are also Toronto-based. And they kind of recognize, too, that there is maybe not a clear place for this type of work. And so they worked really hard to create this performance event called Dord, where artists were invited to, make short works for audiences and kind of experiment and get a bit weird. And so I think, my work comes out of that and is indebted to their labor for sure, in putting that on and supporting it.
Comes out of weird.
Yeah.
The landscape that you find yourselves and your I want to say cast of characters. I mean, it seems like they're gathered together. I can't quite figure out what that community is, but how do you relate to the notion of that question of where is here?
I guess this idea of place is really important, and the notion of landscape. But for me, it's not necessarily about identity or culture necessarily. It's more about bringing these people, these performances in the land and kind of create these new languages through the gesture and through the performance that I'm creating. So there's something more open to it in the idea that it's not about like the cultural ways of being in the land and creating new ways of being through the process of the work.
Who are those remarkable looking people? When I look at the videos, they look like they're both out of time and in time right now, so that I can't frame what actual time period I'm looking at. Do you want that sense of ambiguity about the characters we're seeing and what it is they're doing in those spaces?
And I guess it started with the places, with these kind of landscape that I started to work with, what I call scars landscape. So these spaces where I feel this in between, or you feel that there's human traces, but you cannot exactly place the body in those spaces because it's the machine that kind of produces them. So for me, there's an openness to these spaces where we can find new ways of living in these spaces. So there's a temporality that kind of get out of time, that I'm really interested in. So where there's a lot of freedom of way of we can interact. So these community that I created are kind of ephemeral. It's like from open calls, but also people that I know and ads that I put in. I kind of mix many people and many sensitive gesture as well. So you have people that are maybe actors or dancers, but you also have people that are just interested to be part of an artistic common gesture. So I'm interested about this kind of, putting all that together and make something improbable.
Improbable, yeah.
About it. That give that feeling that you're talking about.
Do you consciously try and find beautiful people? I mean, everybody looks so good. I mean, what's going on with that?
I mean,
just good
it's
makeup?
Not about, no, there's no makeup. It's not about beautiful people, but I would say it's about, like, sometimes I can see someone in the street that, for me, there's a character in that person. And I just ask him, I give him my card and say, if you like, I'm doing these performances, So it's, for me, there's something that I'm very interested about that person that I would like to explore. So I create this kind of script of gesture through the performance, and I dressed all the people and I kind of place everything, and then I just let go the performance for an hour and a half. So each person that I invite has a certain form of freedom through these performances, and then we record with photography and video. And I'm interested to observe what they're doing and how they embody like the whole situation and the task. And I guess the feeling of beautiful is, I don't know, I had the same feeling when I saw the image, so I picked them.
One of the things that, and this seems to work for all of your work that I noticed in going through, not just what I saw here today, but in going through your various bodies of work, is a sense of what I want to call, I'm picking a line actually from poetry. Emily Dickinson has a poem which she talks about seeing things slant, which is to say she never, in her poetry, never looks at anything directly. She always comes at it a kind of indirection, so things don't come out and get declared right away. There seems to be in a lot of your work a sense of a lack of disclosure, and I mean that in a positive way, that the message isn't immediately on the surface. In fact, in lots of ways it's obscured. You have to decipher it, you have to find it somehow. Is that a conscious way of making art, and why would it be useful to you? I can start with you, Ramon, because your work fits that description.
Like a really important thing to me is like Viktor Shklovsky, the Russian literary critic, talking about the operation of art being akin to the knight's move, forward but to the side. So an oblique approach that is kind of like the world as we know it, but different, existing in parallel, simultaneously. That is about like somehow if the work of art was radically different from our world, it would be unrecognizable. So it has to exist or trade in the materials and images and actions of our world to a certain extent, but it needs to change them in some way. So I imagine it through that like spatial sort of movement of the knight's move.
Oh. So is your work a way of wanting to, in a sense, open up the possibility of the reading of the knight's move then? So are there two worlds coexisting in the process?
The thing I'm thinking about is like this thing, even thinking of an anecdote like, it might be sort of apocryphal, but Marshall McLuhan like reading only the right page of every book and just like filling in the rest of that information as being something that is about like a willful disorientation of one's experience of a thing. So thinking of that, like I think of like text on a page, the dominant form would be the book. So it really becomes this thing of like altering the conventions in a way that kind of like allows for seeing them simultaneously, or at least seeing more of them than you're used to. So it really becomes about like trying to be attentive to those like material and formal conventions of these objects and figuring out like what are the opportunities to make these things do something else, to put stress on them, to reveal those conventions somehow.
And Divya, you in fact, you also use text in a lot of your work, have used it, but it's not conventional text in that it does read from one side to another, but it keeps getting broken up. And in fact, you've used in some of your series white on white, so while the text is there, it's almost not even readable. So there's a sense of resistance to the direct and immediate read. That's clearly strategic on your part.
Yes. Yeah.
And you'll have to do a little more than that, by the way. You know how this
Definitely.
goes. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it, am I just the worst at this? I'm sorry. Yeah, I definitely try to create very inaccessible spaces. I mean, even with this install, the placement of the bricks was something that was like sort of debated about for a number of days. And I really actually wanted to brick up the doorway in its entirety so everyone could just not enter, which is wonderful. Like it's just me that thinks it's wonderful, obviously.
I think it's wonderful.
Because that didn't happen.
Yeah,
did it?
I didn't have enough bricks. But I mean, yeah, definitely. Like I don't. If you were to just like present whatever your idea is and just be like, okay, I just want you to consume this and engage with it and get over it and whatever. I don't know what the point of making anything like that would be. Like there would be no space for dialogue because you would just walk in and like say like, okay, I get this, and walk back out. So creating a space that's like deliberately like a high white with like very white text and like fluorescent lights so that you essentially can't read anything is like, yes, it's like very important in terms of my practice, like creating inaccessible, frustrating spaces for everyone to engage with.
So don't bother with hers.
Yeah, that's it.
No, but it worked because it forces you, I mean,
to spend more time in the
obliges
space.
the responsibility on the viewer to spend time.
Yeah, definitely.
I guess it's the old slow down thing in lots of ways.
Yeah. I guess in like a ruder way, though. It's like you need to slow down.
Yeah.
It's not just like, slow down.
Your performances are, I mean, I haven't been through the duration of them, but getting a sense of them. How does time play into your work and this notion of time being a thing that, how does the viewer engage with the time of your work then?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think I find because my performances are, there's some that are like 18 hours in duration and 6 hours and 3 hours or like 30 minutes in duration. So it all depends on what I like to think about is like what am I trying to say and who am I talking to? And then I kind of design it based upon that. So for instance, if I'm doing, I have a series of collaborative works that's like a kind of like a lament, or kind of yeah, I guess it would be more like a lament. These songs that I work with different collaborators, where it's called the Land Sing series, and so we basically write a song, like a score based on the topography of the land, and it's all about kind of it's almost like a relationship with the land, where we're apologizing for making all of these scars, and because the line of the typography goes through landfills and highways and all of these places that humans have scarred. And then so the singers and myself, we learn the score and then we sing it for anywhere from like 3 to 6 hour period, dependent upon I guess the comfort of my collaborator, because I want them to experience kind of pushing themselves past their comfort level, but not to the point where they injure themselves. So some people can do like 3-hour song and other people can do a 6-hour song. So, but I never expect, you know, the viewer or the audience to come and sit for a 3 or 6 hour period. I just figure somebody will come in, you know, spend a bit of time, whatever their own local experiences with regards to that piece. Some people are drawn to it because of the music. Some people are drawn to it because of kind of maybe the theatrical situation that it's put into. And other places, like for instance in Toronto, when we did that same project with the Monomyths festival that happened last year, the Monomyths series, Cheryl Rondell and I at the theater center, we sang for 3 hours, and the entire audience stayed for the entire 3 hours. And I was like blown. I was like, I can't believe people sat for 3 hours listening to the same verse of music for that entire 3 hour period. So it's kind of, it depends on, I guess, who I'm trying to talk to and what I'm trying to say. And I feel like that interaction, that relationship is extremely important. And there was something really magical that happened in that space because those people went on that physical journey, you know, sitting on wooden bleachers. They were as uncomfortable as we were singing for 3 hours, because they're like adjusting their bodies and trying to figure out, okay, how do we get through this, because there's like an hour and a half left. So it was definitely something that you don't often see, where people kind of like stick through the entire performance with you, if it's a durational one, for instance.
But in relation to what Divya said about her original intention would be to build the bricks that you could only look into the gallery. One of the intriguing things about your piece here is that, from a phenomenological point of view, if you want to enter it, you go through those that roll thing, but you can push the top two, but the bottom two hit either your knee or your shins, and it actually it hurts. It's interesting. And then once you're inside, you realize, oh, you could have simply opened the latch, you know, and got in that way. But that's not the way it does that. So I assume that also, that point of entry and exit is very strategic on your part, and you want that level of discomfort for the viewer, participator in going into that space if they decide to do that.
Absolutely, yeah. Because it's about, you know, inviting, making the invitation. Be like, you know, you can come and sit and have dinner at my dinner table, but all of the plates are going to be like, you know, like shards of porcelain that have been put back together. And then you're like, oh, okay, this is how we're going to eat. But it's up to you whether you're going to sit down and stay for the meal, or if you're like, actually, you know, I'm full.
I get interested in the way that pieces are apprehended. The piece you did earlier this afternoon, I get all jazzed up and then I go way too far. I mean, I like that idea. And the notion of limits and limitations on how you not just perform, but what your expectations are of the audience's tolerance for what it is you're going to do. No, I mean this in a very positive way. I mean, I sense that that's very carefully calibrated on your part. I mean, these are not arbitrary performances. They must be worked within an inch of their life, time-wise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the kind of way that I work involves just having one audio track that has all of the cues laid out within it, so that I know I can just hit play and then go for it.
But the notion of how far you can go. Is that a measure that ever comes into your sensibility as you're writing? It seems to me that it's the writing more than the performing that is the issue in some ways, but I may be wrong about that.
In terms of like limitations?
Yeah, well, not the limitations you have as a performer or writer, but what the audience is, how far you'll go with maybe making the audience either angry or uncomfortable. Is that a consideration that you have?
Probably not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like most audiences are kind of up for anything, I guess, in a lot of ways. And yeah, I don't really presume too much about even how an audience member might react to what it is that I'm doing. It's more, yeah, kind of about the process of doing it and doing it in sequence. And maybe I'm more interested, yeah, in these kinds of disparate seeming parts suddenly being put in an order, and then the kind of like when you are witness to that and watch that, your brain kind of starts making associations or drawing out these kinds of contradictions, and that yeah, I'm more interested in how that will affect an audience member and how they will be able to draw out maybe their own sense of meaning from.
It's interesting because the way you draw it out, I mean, I think of that wonderful piece performance you do with the toilet plunger that it becomes, you know, on your stomach, and then it becomes something you drink and you get a bit ripped, and then suddenly it's stuck on your face. It seems like in the piece you did today that hand, which starts out as a comb, and then you start to riff on it. Does the prop generate the narrative, or do you have an idea and then all of a sudden you said, oh, this hand, I can use this in some way, and then that's what generates the narrative?
It's kind of, there are a lot of things going on at once, I think, all of the time. So I'm kind of always writing things, and then always collecting things, and then always collecting little audio pieces. And then eventually those kind of get filtered into a kind of common idea or something like this, and get edited kind of carefully, and then the order gets kind of chosen. But yeah, I mean, usually I have to know an object can do a lot of things if I want to work with it.
It's funny how much you can get out of that goofy hand. I mean, it really goes. No, and it gets a little bit. It's very weighty at a certain point. I mean, you have a lovely sense of the turn where what seemed to be absurdly and stupidly humorous suddenly becomes poignant and dangerous almost. I mean, that's an interesting shift that happens very quickly somehow. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think just in terms of what everyone was kind of talking about earlier, this idea of like the slant. I think that's something that is what interests me about this idea of like comedy or humor, is that we're taking these things that are, you know, kind of commonly understood or accepted, and then what the pleasure of a joke is to turn that on its head and bring about some unexpected kind of turn, and that there's like a great satisfaction in that.
In your work, in watching, for instance, these two videos here, the beauty of the close-ups of feet and hands all the time. It's as if you've kind of fragmented the image somehow and broken it down, and that becomes a kind of narrative in which people seem to be doing things that don't add up to anything somehow. I mean, I'm interested in what the narrative in these pieces are, if there indeed is a narrative at all that we've discerned from it.
So I guess it's in the process that it all builds up, but I'm more like interested about the process of them doing the things and the actual result of it. So it's something that first, when I started to work on these tableaux vivants, was really in the realm of seeing. So I was embracing, you know, the whole scene with the landscape, and it was something more narrative about it. And then I wondered how I could get closer and find a camera that would be empathic somehow, that would make the viewer kind of part of it. And I was trying to explore the actual experience of the performance, you know, so not only understanding it, but feeling it somehow. So it was not only about the sense of the view, but it started to be about all the other sense of, you know, feeling a space and feeling a relationship and feeling a movement. So this is how like the camera kind of shifted and started to be close and closer. And so it became like all the part of that actual scene, you know, at that actual tableau. So I really think my work as, you know, the notion of tableau vivant, but there is this, you know, this idea that all the part of that video bring that together, you know. So the temporality of it is that one scene, but you just go in that kind of flow of movement and gesture to the editing. So it's not, and as a viewer, you always kind of have that step back to kind of understand, but also it's kind of nice to just be in in that sense of flow and movement with the performer.
And kind of visceral intensity, you feel the sawdust on your own skin
right,
when you're
exactly.
watching. And then there's an extraordinary moment in the one film where the figures are working with rocks, and someone cuts their hand, and all of a sudden there's blood spots on the stone, and then you see the finger that's bleeding, and there's something so magnetically visceral and about that you just can't forget it after that happens. That obviously wasn't planned. You didn't say.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I would say that my work is really about this kind of in-between sense of controlling as the mise en scène kind of work, right? Every part of the scene is kind of planned, and where I invite people to be part of that, performative gesture, and I just let it go for that hour and a half. And as the artist, I just step back and I don't control anything anymore. So I kind of set all the rules, all the tasks, all the script and everything in the image, and then I just let the image go and I look at it, and then things happen. And then I become somehow a viewer. I'm not the artist anymore.
Oh, really?
And I kind of like this double state, and when I go back with the footage or with the films, and then I look at it, and there's some image in there that I don't understand. And this is strange because I kind of invented that form, but there's something mysterious about it that I'm interested to kind of dig in, and I start with that, and that's the beginning of the actual piece, that's going to end.
There's a nice thing too in your installation where the two videos seem to be, they speak to one another somehow, and it's as if the photographs are a sort of lovely glue that also holds them together. But it's just a this gallery works very well for all of your work, it seems to me. I mean, the spaces are very accommodating. That's probably about time, isn't it? And we can open it up to some questions from the audience. I'm sure that many of you have questions that, look at that. Now, I don't know how you want the questions asked. Does it matter who the people are? No, I mean, I would want to hear them, but do they have to say who they are, or stand up by all means,
I'd
sir.
like to know who they are.
To begin with, I'm not an art expert. I did have an opportunity to see your exhibits. My name is Monty McMurchie, and I'm going to make one reference, notwithstanding Northrop Frye, where is here, but why not in terms of Margaret Atwood, survival, in terms of where we are as a nation status. And what intrigues me in terms of anything to do with art public is that there is an objective bias regardless of how you cement your work. And one of your works, and I'm not going to mention it right now, I'll mention it to you privately, I found it extremely intrusive. And I'm not saying that as a positive or as a negative, but that is to me the epistemological aspect of art public, that it does not leave you neutral. That I can say there's nothing sacred, and that to me would be not worse than anodyne. But I have a question to each of you, or who cares to answer it. Have you ever felt intimidated? Have you ever considered yourself to be embarrassed in your projection? And I thank you very much.
Go ahead, just Amy, Raymond.
A thing I think about a lot is Trevor Mahovsky, who is based here now, in a talk about the sublime in studio practice, talked about the fact that the encounter with the sublime in the studio is the fact that anything you're making could be incredibly meaningful or totally meaningless. So art, like I see it as just like communicates some shameful thing that is like, oh, here, like, I'm embarrassed, but please take it, like. So I think there's always like some character of that. It's like, I'm not gonna like listen to this talk after because it's gonna be embarrassing for me.
Anyone else? You can't not let that question go.
I think Raymond answered all of that.
Hashtag same.
Hashtag same.
It's a nice question in one way, because the problem with Canadians is they tend not to ever try and do anything that will alienate or get anyone angry. So the fact that only one of the pieces alienated you or is maybe a failure on the part of the other four people up here. But, I mean, it is, art can get under your skin, and this work, your cage is, I mean, it fascinates me. It's also very beautiful in a strange, there's something about it, the nature of the construction, I don't know. You must feel that too.
Well, I think that's kind of I don't know, I guess I would like to consider that a bit of my MO, where it's like, okay, let me try to create a situation or an object or an event or something where hopefully everybody's going to feel a little bit, ooh, like what just happened or what is that, and to make them either want to explore it to figure out what it is, or maybe they're just not ready to, and they'll be like, you know what, I can't handle this, I'm out of here. Be like, okay. Like I said, I served you to dinner.
You're going back to the place setting.
Exactly.
Another question?
Because I think it's, I think it's important to invoke and to provoke some of that. Because if art can't invoke or provoke that type of uncomfortable situation in us, then, like Raymond said, like, why are we doing this?
Other questions? Yes, sir.
My name's Richard Childs, Ursula. I saw Kip Monkman's exhibit here many times, and that room in particular invoked an experience for me where I saw Indigenous people cry when he was guiding a tour through there. So I entered your cage through that learning and that spirit. And entering there, I felt like a broken person. I felt like it was imprisonment of a people.
It's interesting you say that, and I'm actually going to share something that I feel like I don't have the privilege to share, because somebody else told me something that somebody else had told them. And they had mentioned to me, and I hadn't, this had never even crossed my mind, but apparently the style of gate, that's the entryway of that there is similar styles of gate along the Israeli border. And that was something that was like news to me, and something I'm definitely interested in kind of looking into. And so I could see how it would make you feel that way, and that's kind of what it's meant to kind of have that, kind of that emotion, because it's like looking at, it's the same thing, because it's these moose fences that's along the Trans-Canada Highway where the moose are separated from their families, and so it's this idea of like, well, how do I get here? How do I get here? Risk my life to feel entrapped in danger, but then this idea of like, at what point in time do we as humans determine what's dangerous and not dangerous with regards to nature? But definitely once it's inside, as opposed to being outside along the side of a highway, it definitely looks like some type of containment vessel. And then when that woman shared the experience of the other woman, then it was like, whoa, that was kind of like mind-blowing. It's something I'm definitely going to look into quite a bit more, and I always appreciate different perspectives with regards to the experiences, because I think that's something that's extremely important in the responsibility of creating something that does invoke such an emotional response. Like, I welcome people to share those responses, because I think that's what it's all about, is to have that, let's talk about what is happening here and why are these happening. And so I thank you very much for sharing your
It invoked
perspective.
150 years of colonialism, where the Indigenous people owned all of Turtle Island and now reduced to reserves 1 to 2% of it.
Thank you.
Another question? There's so many curators in the room. They're never quiet, or normally they're not quiet. Why would they be today? Then I want to, Jennifer.
I'll ask one of Raymond specifically about, you spoke about the denial of meaning or the opacity of your work through an artistic lens, but can you talk about it more as a political gesture?
Well, I think like something I'm thinking about, and like it's informed by this thing that was just shared too, that is about often like I make these references to things, I can't help it. Like I think of like Charlotte Townsend Galt talking about how like the artwork of Indigenous people is always framed through a narrative of misfortune. Indigenous peoples are the victims of colonialism, the victims of diabetes, of like substance abuse generally. So there's this way in which it becomes this like dominant framework through which Indigenous art is understood, often presented transparently as communicating these things. So in terms of like dealing with opacity or things that like almost like don't cohere in front of you, in fact there are plenty of times when like often the work is experienced in a way which sort of looks past that that text that accumulates. That a lot of that is about like giving some sense of the fact that the artwork doesn't serve any strict function in terms of doing something for us. That ultimately that opacity is about understanding I guess the disavowal of the artwork's ability to abduct our agency. That it's like we have to remain active in front of it. That it's something that we can't just like get the artwork to do it for us. So that opacity is about like, you know, being confronted with the thing where it's like, oh, those are just pages on a wall. It's like that there's a different circumstance that is like the social context of it, the fact that we might stand in that room together and conceive of the way in which we each constitute a part of the public, and considering our unequal sort of presence within that public, I think is about like not being able to like fall into the image. It's about that opacity of like having it just like I guess like resist or repel.
When you do that wonderful series you did on the gas stations, I mean, you know, you're a professor, you know the origin of that in some senses is Ed Ruscha. Does the weight of the already having been made in art contribute somehow to your projects?
I definitely think of the dialogic character of it, that I can't just make a work that issues solely from me, that it participates in a conversation that extends beyond myself, forwards and backwards, like of my own nation, but also art history.
Sure.
So a lot of it becomes about like understanding the potential for that, and that simply being a point of access for the work as opposed to its meaning. So the association with Ruscha, or people have also mentioned Edward Curtis in relation to those photographs, becomes something that is about like the flexibility of those references that are present but not necessarily dominant, but accessible.
Yeah, they're not determining. They're residual in one sense. They're a kind of trace. I mean, your relationship with your great-grandmother's tradition to learning, and the fact that you are making new objects that don't have the same kind of function. Clearly, there's such a direct, line, an important emotional line for you in the way that you're reusing the past. That's a sort of an obvious thing to say, but it's interesting that you're making objects that are not, even though you've curated a show of your great-grandmother's work, your work is a departure from that and a different kind of basket weaving, although the methodology, I gather, is the one that you learned from your great-grandmother.
Yeah, it's all the same techniques and manipulations of the materials, but it's looking at the kind of like this vessel or the functionality of this vessel, and specifically related to I guess kind of like the trade economy of which those vessels came to be, because it was through that trade economy that created these very specific types of vessels that we know that exist in museums all around the world in the past 400 years. So I was kind of looking at this idea of, well, what if we fast forward another 150 years, and then you look at that continuum of Mi'kmaq basketry, and all of a sudden you hit 2010 and there's all these mutated, morphed baskets that have all these strange meanings, like commemorating somebody's otherworldly experience and different things like that. I just kind of thought it would be fun to kind of throw a wrench in that timeline of art history where, especially in museology, when you're looking at something, you're like, oh, this came from this culture and it meant this, and so it was kind of, and then you get to this and you're like, what happened? Was there a social revolution in the Mi'kmaq communities? What was going on here with all these strange you know, kind of forms. It's just trying to have fun with that idea of like thinking about, you know, where in that timeline of information that we're putting out there and creating and, you know, cataloging and archiving as humans to try to illustrate this experience that we're having on this planet, you know, to kind of market for other people in the future. So I thought it was kind of like a bit of a fun thing at the same time as exploring the theory with regards to language and the survivance of those cultural practices.
Just a quick answer from you all. It's a totally unfair question because it comes out of an old project, and that's modernism. Modernism's a great project, was always to make it new. Does newness matter to you, to any of you? Are you trying to make something that is new? Is that part of the deal? It comes out of your notion that these things are in some senses residual, that they're there, but they're not determining. But what was determining for artists was that they had to be original.
Scott Richard Lyons has this book, X Marks Native Signatures of Descent, that's entirely about Indigenous identity and how it is that Indigenous people operate in relation to tradition. And he describes tradition as the capacity to make the old feel new and to make the new feel old. So I think it's about oldness and newness existing in tension with one another, that the newness is determined by what has came before.
He's a bit summary that way, isn't he? There's no point in saying anything.
I was going to say hashtag same.
Yeah, everybody says yeah. Anyone have anything to add to the notion of newness?
Well, I think similar to what Raymond is saying, that there's always that, you know, because somebody else has already begun that conversation, and for us, you know, being young emerging artists, then I feel like it would be a disservice if we didn't engage with those conversations that have begun, because it's, you know, it's almost like you'd be like, I don't want to hear it, I'm just going to say what I want to say.
Well, thank you very much, all of you. And you have a question?
Yes, unless you're finished.
No, I mean, we're not. Ask the question.
It's a question about performance, and there's a lot of performance in each of the practices, but it's about the absence of applause. And the end of your performance today, Brigitte, there's a line in one of the pieces that was something like, I'm not sure if it's finished, or I'm not sure how to end it.
If it's memory or dream as well.
Yeah. And it feels as though you disappear, and we're all sort of waiting to see what happens next. And I know, Ursula, when you choreograph performances, there's a sense of sometimes leaving it to the moment to have the ending be determined. And your work, Justin, feels like a performance that's heavily choreographed, even though you're saying there's quite a lot left to kind of an improvisation. Is there any idea that there needs to be an end, or you're seeking applause, or you're seeking an end to that moment?
Yeah, I always think about, like, at the end of a performance, my ideal scenario would be that I would just stop existing completely, and that, like, yeah. But yeah, it's sort of like the difficulty of working with liveness and like reality is that I'm tucked behind a wall, kind of waiting. Yeah, and so I guess it's kind of like an impossibility of like what does an end even look like? And then I'll do that performance again. So where's the end there? It's confusing.
And you don't come for applause.
No, but I mean, like, maybe when people start applauding paintings, then and like artists come to receive that, then I would feel like it would make sense. But otherwise, I feel like, no, that's the work. The work is done.
That's fair.
Yeah.
I think it's part of that thing that ending's like teleological. It's like it feels like, oh, endings are heavy. Like you want it to be a continuing thing that like specifically thinking of like what it means to have this sort of like weight of colonial history, that it's like it's that thing where there was like an enforced ending to things. Things didn't stop. So it's like, I think like so it becomes that thing where if there's a sense of the undecidability of it, if there's still like some motivation in it that causes one to not be clear about like how it's delimited or where its edges are, that there's like a important perceptual thing there in terms of like, oh, I had a student who was doing a performance in the class last week. She makes clothes and she just started getting undressed and dressing. Everyone thought it was a performance, but it's like, oh, it's like, no, she's just getting dressed. It's like, we actually don't have to watch her while she does it. It's like, so there's something important about that, like, yeah.
And Divya, your whole work, you know, you had a work and now it's a whole new work. It's just that continuum.
Yeah, sorry, what is the question at this
There
point?
is no question.
There's no question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, with that work, it's like, it like had to get to a new space. Like it wasn't, what it was in 2010 didn't make sense. Like the, you know, my response to like that particular problem, that particular question had completely changed at this point in my life, and I didn't feel like I could present that same sort of work or conversation like to everybody, to say like come in and visit this as something. I also really like performing. I love coffee. I don't know. I'm like, yeah, that's good. That's good.
You're a good performer. You're a good lip syncer. That Disney, the whole new world is still just gets you every time.
It does. I'm glad to hear that.
It's
We're talking about performing together.
Really?
The
No,
three of
that's
us.
interesting.
Yeah.
We're
You
just
three?
looking to
It's the
recruit
three,
a fourth. Yeah, we're
Yeah.
still. Bridget's
It's actually the
like,
five
"Oh,
of
I don't know
us.
about you
Surprise
guys."
everybody.
Well, let's all applaud the
Yeah.
oncoming performer. Did you want to announce anything about the reception or anything else?
I don't even, oh, it's on, okay. As I mentioned earlier, there's the opening at the Art Museum at 6 o'clock. So if you do want to see more about, the works by these wonderful artists, I invite you to come and see.